The sheer math of climate change has become so overwhelming that everyone recognizes that we need to do this.
This is going to be a really pivotal year.
Carbon capture,
wind and solar.
Electrified vehicles.
Anything's possible if you try and be patient. It pays off while you're waiting. The seeds you water will grow, the rest will follow. Cause this life's what you make it, and some rules are for breaking. Destiny will play its role, you know. What's meant to be will be, even when it's not easy. Live your life free, no boundaries, even when it's not easy. If you give love, you get love. If you give up, you get nothing. Can't you see? If you just believe, anything's possible. Don't rush too much when it gets rough. Get tough, sing with me. Through everything, anything is possible. Doesn't always make sense why some things gotta happen. Fight through the rain, cause you know the sun will follow. If you practice persistence, somebody's gonna witness you're working hard.
Riding around town, me and her now, under the city lights. She shines big when I look at her, that's why she's my bright eyes. Why she's my bright eyes. Coming down from the high love, no one can stop us now. We sit and talk about our love, no one can top us now. Look me in the eyes, love, tell me you feel the same. Your blue eyes pierce right through me, you tell me you feel the same. Over and out, I'm taking chances.
This is just the beginning.
Welcome to AAPI Heritage Month, Actions Beyond May and 2021, a virtual event. I'm Hope King, business reporter. Welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and on Axios.com. Join the conversation today on Twitter with @Axios and #Axios Events. Over the next 30 minutes, I'll be joined by my colleagues Naila Boudou and Sarah Keolani Gu. We'll be discussing how AAPI leaders in media, policy, and philanthropy plan to build on the momentum of unity over the past year. Our first guests for today's event are Sonal Shah, president of the Asian American Foundation, and actor and producer Daniel Dae Kim. Sonal and Daniel, thank you for joining us and welcome to Axios.
So great to be here. Thank you, Hope.
Thanks a lot.
Sonal, I want to start with you. Axios was first to report last week on the historic $1 billion raise by the Asian American Foundation on the same day that President Biden signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. It was also your birthday. There was a CS Unite campaign in Times Square, the shows on cable. How do you plan to keep this momentum going beyond May?
Well, Hope, thank you for this. And it's such an important, I think we launched in May with certain importance of what we've given to the community and to make sure that the community can come together. As we move forward, there's so many other things that are coming. We'll have a few reports coming out in June, one with the with Urban Institute on sort of a landscape analysis of the Asian American community. But more than that, we're looking at all of the different moments that are coming up. June is Immigrant Heritage Month. Then there will be the September 11th anniversary in September on 9/11, and that's a 20-year anniversary. We know these moments are very important, and we're going to continue this momentum because hate isn't going away. We're seeing it every day, whether it's to the Asian American community, to the Black community, or to the Jewish American communities. We know it's important that we need to address, and this is not going away. So we're going to keep the momentum up. We've got reports coming out, we've got events coming up, and we think it's important to keep going.
That massive amount of money, philanthropic dollars coming in from corporate partners from different areas of the US. I know that you've talked about those three areas: education, data research, and fighting against the hate. When you look at that other category of fighting against the hate, I mean, how do you break that down? Because, you know, hate is taught, it's systemic. How do you really plan to address that?
So three ways we're looking to address that. One is just catching the data first, making sure we're consistently collecting it, not just in moments when we see hate incidents increasing, but across and in between at all times. So one is just capturing the data, making sure we're capturing it according to what the incidents are, where they are, and making sure we can work with government and we can work with communities to address it. Two is addressing and helping families. This is not just about the data we collect, but it's the families and the communities that are being affected. So making sure that the organizations we support can also address and help families and communities. And three is long-term prevention. And that also means education. So they're not all separate categories. It's actually bringing all of those pieces together. We need to educate others about our communities, who we are, what we are. We are part of the American story. We are living the American story and making sure that the Asian American story is part of that story.
Right, especially in those textbooks in schools. I know that's part of the plan. Daniel, I want to turn to you. I mean, really, since the beginning of the year, you've been at the forefront of Hollywood, of the Asian community, raising awareness, even putting out a bounty of sorts, right, to track down some of the people who are responsible for these hate crimes. They haven't stopped. How do you plan to keep up the momentum here?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And I like to think of it more of as a reward than a bounty, because the connotations of each word are specific. But I will say that it is important for those of us who have a platform to continue to use it. And I think one of the best things that has come from the events of the past few months is that there has been a coming together, a galvanization of our community that we haven't had in a really long time. And that includes those of us who are in entertainment or in sports or in media in some way. We've formed a collective community. And so we're able to amplify messages in multiples as opposed to individually just talking about a particular incident in an Instagram post. Now we are amplifying in a much more expansive, coordinated way. And actually TAF is an example of one of the ways that we're coming together.
Speaking of coordination, you and many of your friends and your peers in media put together several events throughout the year to create places and spaces for people to come and share their feelings on Clubhouse. I'm thinking about, across many different platforms. What have been some of the stories that you've heard sort of over and over again as you've hosted these for hours at a time?
Well, thank you for mentioning that, Hope, and thank you for your efforts in that regard too, because I know you've been a part of this. But I will say that a common refrain has really been two things. One, that we need to speak up as a community more. There are many of us who come forward and said, we haven't personally felt empowered enough to speak from our own personal experiences. And I think coming together in this way and having an organization like TAF gives us an infrastructure through which we can speak. I think the other thing is that people ironically are talking about the opposite thing, that we are speaking up and we're not being heard. And so it's an interesting thing to have both of those dynamics at play at the same time. Those of us in the Asian American community know that we have been active in speaking up against hate and bigotry for generations. It's just that right now the spotlight is on us in a way that we haven't had it before. And so I think it's really important for us to take advantage of this moment in the best of ways to highlight these stories that have affected us for so long.
And Sonal, we've talked about the idea of inclusivity as well. When you have an organization like this and you now have so much support, I'm sure you are getting many calls, many people saying, hey, we really need assistance here locally. How do you address everybody if you can, and we can't forget about the big A here, the big Asian community with the hate crimes that spiked after 9/11, and even most recently in Indianapolis with members of the Sikh community, and also in Wisconsin almost a decade ago. A lot of times when people think about the Asian community, it sort of leans one way. How are you trying to address that?
Yeah, Hope, that's a great question. And I think just to highlight a quick point on what Daniel said about, making sure we're all speaking up together and making sure we use this moment to speak up. I just want to add in here, one of the things that TAF can do and will do is making sure we're bringing these communities together, the Sikh community, the Muslim community, the South Asian, Southeast Asian, all of the various communities, the Pacific Islander communities, all of the communities that are being affected, and making sure we're reaching out to them as a first step, making sure we're talking to them as a second step. 3, bringing them together to participate in the hate collection, the data collection that we're doing. We've created a data working group, which we want to bring all of the communities together to do that. And it's important that we do that because before just even taking grant applications, it's actually just reaching out and having conversations. And that is a first step for us, which we've already started the process and will continue to do.
And Daniel, on your part, we've seen the programming that HBO, that MTV, Apple, many of these big platforms have dedicated a certain part of their real estate on their platforms to spotlighting Asian American stories. What other changes have you seen sort of in Hollywood and media that gives you optimism that this is going to continue beyond this month and this year?
Well, I think it is a work in progress. We have made a lot of strides, but what's clear is that there's a lot to do. When you see a report like the one that was released by Launch.org that tells us that 42% of Americans can't name a single prominent Asian American, it tells us the degree of our invisibility. And when the second and third answers are Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee, we're really talking about a real gap in terms of time, and where people cannot think of someone who looks like us. And so, this is why it's very clear that we need to continue working in this way, and it's why it's nice that one of TAF's mission is to create narrative, to change our perceptions in the media, to recreate our story, and to make sure that we have education that doesn't allow us to be invisible in the future.
And part of that, and going back to the historic fundraise, in just the past couple of weeks, I mean, when TAF launched at the beginning of May was, an initial 125 million with some partners. And now in the last, 2 weeks, you've raised an additional 750 million. What are the corporate partners saying to you that also, Sonal, from your perspective, makes you believe that they are serious about actually following through with their commitments?
Well, one, I think it's important to recognize that all these corporate partners just in the last few weeks decided to join in with us. We announced on May 3rd, in between May 3rd and May 20th, they sort of came together and said, yes, we want to be a part of it. So we commend them for joining us. What's been important about those conversations is they want not only to highlight Asian Americans, but they're looking at their staff and their communities and saying, how do we work with our Asian American, the communities, the folks that work with us? How do we look at the communities we live in and making sure that we're being highlighted? And three, they're stepping up to do more for the Asian American communities. That was the commitment for the Giving Challenge, which is to do more, not just what you were doing, but do it for 5 years. That's really important, because what we need is the corporate sector, we need the social sector, we need the financial sector, we need the foundations, we need business, we need artists, everybody to come together, because in order for us to change the way we're thought about, we need the ecosystem to think differently about Asian Americans and see us for all the things that we are doing and participating in and actively engaged in.
The See Us campaign in Times Square was a very visible way of, I think, showing where the commitments are coming from, and also representation of all the work that you have done in just the short few weeks that you've been publicly open about TAF. So Sonal and Daniel, thank you both so much for joining us here on Axios. Sonal Shah is the president of the Asian American Foundation, and Daniel Dae Kim is an actor and producer and an advisory member there as well. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And next, we talk about the recent growth in AAPI voter participation and the Hate Crimes Act with my colleague, Sarah Kailani-Gu.
Thank you, Hope. I'm Sarah Kailani-Gu. I'm the executive editor at Axios. Joining me now is Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii and Stephanie Cho. She's the executive director of the Asian Americans for Advancing Justice in Atlanta. Welcome to you both.
Aloha. Hi.
And aloha to you. A special welcome to you both in this conversation. I want to focus on policy and politics. Senator Hirono, let's start with you. You just sponsored a bill that became law last week, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, meant to directly combat anti-Asian American hate in this country. It gives the Attorney General new authority to track hate crimes, as well as some funding for localities. And the amazing thing actually in Washington is that it got quite a lot of bipartisan support. I wanted to ask you, how did you do that? How did you accomplish that bipartisan support? And where does this go next?
The bill was introduced in the context of the massive, I would say, a substantial increase in hate crimes against the AAPI community, Asian American Pacific Islander community. And so Chuck Schumer, our majority leader, wanted to bring it to the floor for debate and vote as soon as possible. We all saw the images of Asian American Pacific Islanders being attacked totally unprovoked, and sometimes horrifically, people standing by doing nothing. So it was important for us to have this bill. And when I first introduced it, I did not get a single Republican co-sponsor. However, as we were dealing with the bill, I got word that Susan Collins, for example, had some concerns about the bill that I thought I could address. And so she and I worked very closely. And it ended up with much more support, bipartisan support for the bill. There were some amendments, some 20 amendments filed. We narrowed that down to 3 that we actually voted on the floor, debated. And even the people who submitted those amendments, which would have pretty much derailed the bill, voted ultimately for the bill with only 1 negative vote. So this was really important for the AAPI community to have the Senate followed by the House, followed only in the sense that not that they were following us, it's just that they subsequently voted on the bill, for us to stand with the AAPI community, something that was so important to the community that has often felt invisible. So it was an important stand for us to take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it was amazing to see that bipartisan support. You got Mitch McConnell on board as well. I wanted to turn to you, Stephanie, as someone who works, in Atlanta, where the most high-profile and horrific attack happened. I wanted to know what you think. Does this bill go far enough? What would you like to see next, either locally or nationally?
I think overall, we'd like to see more work around preventative measures. There's really a difference between what many people experience, which is hate violence, and as a result of white supremacy. And so we'd like to see more educational opportunities, K through 12, also in higher education. We'd like to see non-carceral solutions as well, more emphasis on mental health, ways to really prevent these acts before they even happen.
Right. It does seem like this is a really difficult problem. We just did a poll actually at Axios with Ipsos. I found a majority of Americans acknowledge and see that there has been a rise in discrimination against Asian Americans since the pandemic started. But I think the problem seems so difficult, right? I mean, they seem to be random. They're not the same attackers. They're not in the same locations. And so it can be difficult to pinpoint even justice in these incidents for individually. It just feels a very difficult problem to solve. And so, as you mentioned, Stephanie, it is difficult to come up with solutions. From the national perspective, Senator, what do you think should happen next?
Of course, passing a bill does not mean that hearts and minds will follow. There are people in our country who bear an animus toward the AAPI community, often regarding us as the other and the perpetual foreigners. So yes, I completely agree with Stephanie that there are historical antecedents to the discrimination against Asians in our country. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the 120,000 Japanese Americans interned during World War II, the Muslim ban. And so this kind of discrimination and racism is never far below the surface in our country. And I mean, we also need to acknowledge, of course, the systemic racism against our Black community and other marginalized groups. So yes, education, prevention, those are all very important aspects of what we need to do. We're not going to solve this situation overnight, but we have to have sustained efforts to call attention and to report these very underreported crimes and incidents.
I want to turn now to ask you a little bit about Asian American Pacific Islanders and their increased participation in civic life, in politics. It's amazing to me to see the numbers out of the 2020 election where Asian Americans we saw a big increase in their voter turnout. For example, in particular, I believe it was 50% of Asian Americans aged 18 to 24 voted in the 2020 election, a huge increase from 4 years earlier. And for you, Senator, in the state of Hawaii, we saw a large increase in voter turnout. What's driving that? What do you think is happening?
A large part of it is organizing that's happening. In Hawaii, though, we went to all-male voting for the first time, and that is what resulted in a huge increase in the people voting. And those are the areas of voting that are being attacked by the hundreds and hundreds of voter suppression bills that are being considered in states all across the country, basically. And so the ability to vote by mail has been one of the major reasons that there has been an increased number of people. Young people are also voting, and there's been an increase. And I think it's a combination of awareness, the need to organize. That is happening in places such as Georgia. However, we need to protect the early voting and vote by mail process. Those are being attacked, and truly, I feel that democracy itself is being attacked in a very, very focused, overt way in all of these states, and there are hundreds of bills that will suppress votes. I call it stealing our votes.
And what about you, Stephanie? The senator mentioned Georgia obviously had a historic Senate election, so local election also of high interest where you are. And, there's been a big outpouring in response to what's happened in Atlanta and the violence there. Where do you see, do you think that this will be sustained 4 years from now in terms of voter action?
I think there's a lot of attention that Georgia and the Asian American community has received even before the shooting. And so that was actually around the general and, of course, the runoff. And so when we look at Asian American participation just even in the last, sort of 10 years, in 2012, we were about 40,000 that cast votes. In 2016, we were about 65,000. And in 2020, we were 208,000. That is really the growth and the sort of coming age of the Asian American electorate here in Georgia and the larger Southeast. And I think we're going to start to see more and more participation despite all of the voter suppression bills. Honestly, Georgia has been a tester state for these voter suppression bills. And in spite of all of that, the Asian American community, the larger BIPOC community overall has increasingly stepped up and really activated our bases, and that continuous organizing and that language equity that is so important in states like ours where there isn't a lot of information in different languages. It's so important to get that on a federal level, not just on a local level.
I see. Senator, my last question is for you. It's so interesting what's happening in this moment in our culture, and it's what you see with Asian Americans speaking out and other folks coming out to support the community. You recently came out with a memoir called Heart of Fire, An Immigrant's Daughter Story, that was published talking about your experience. You're the only immigrant senator currently serving, and talked about your life experience growing up born in Japan, growing up in Hawaii. And, I really wanted to know about your perspective of, what's happening in the AAPI community now in this next generation that you're seeing in terms of involvement in civics and politics. Compare that with your experience growing up. What changes are you seeing?
What we're seeing is a lot of young people, not just in the AAPI community, but young people across the board who are becoming very vocal, and they are getting involved on climate change and you name it. They are engaged in what's going on. So that gives me hope. With regard to the AAPI community, that there are certain stereotypes that have been applied to our community. This is one of the reasons that, as I was talking about the COVID hate crimes bill, that there were Asian friends of mine who said often our community has felt invisible. Maybe not so much anymore, because I've seen more AAPI speaking up at a time like this for our community, and doing so we speak out for other marginalized groups. So we're becoming very vocal, something that the stereotype of AAPIs, we're demure, we're reserved, all of that. We need to use our voices. And so the combination of, in my journey of using my head, my heart, and my voice, I am a more complete person because I now use those three parts of me. And that's what I hope that a lot of people will come to. And then particularly the young people are getting there so much faster than the time it took me to get to where I am now, where I'm quite vocal, as you probably know.
That's right. Well, it's so great to get your perspective for you, Senator, and for you, Stephanie Cho. Both of you, thank you so much for your time and our conversation.
Thank you. Aloha. Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Sarah.
Aloha. And next, for our final segment, I'll turn it back over to my colleague, Nyla Boodoo.
Hi, I'm Nyla Boodoo, host of the Axios Today podcast. And our final guests today are Cam Ashling, co-founder and chairwoman of the Asian American Action Fund, and Victoria Lee, co-founder of Welcome to Chinatown. Cam, Victoria, welcome to our Axios event. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us. Cam, I wonder if we can start with you. And can we start with, actually, we've been talking about building momentum through May in 2021, but I wonder if we can go back actually to the 2020 election. And I wonder if you can share with us how grassroots voter turnout made a difference in the Asian American community. What were the issues that you think brought people out in the presidential election last fall?
Well, a huge issue for us on the ground was fighting COVID and then fighting the racism that came with the COVID-19 being called the Kung Flu virus, and then like the China virus. So we were definitely very concerned about racism and getting our community healthy again and getting our businesses stronger.
And do you think that also made a difference in the special election in January?
Yes, because we needed our senators to vote on these issues we care about. So we made a big point in our communication to make sure people understood why it was so important and how historic the Senate races were in Georgia.
Victoria, what prompted you to start Welcome to Chinatown? We were just hearing Cam talk about racism and how much that motivated voters in Georgia.
That was certainly a factor. So myself, my co-founder, Jennifer Tam, we are residents of Manhattan's Chinatown. I'm a born and raised New Yorker, and we were really concerned about the impacts of the xenophobic rhetoric that had been pushed out there. And talking with a lot of our small business owners, they were really concerned about the survival of their businesses. They had felt the prolonged impacts of xenophobia and COVID well before New York City's pause in March. About 80% of small businesses said that, about 50% of our small businesses said that they had felt declined up to 80% or more well before pause. So that's where we felt we needed to step in order to ensure that Chinatown wasn't going to be affected and face further accelerated gentrification.
And moving to this year, Welcome to Chinatown's goal, I know, is to distribute $1 million in grants to Manhattan, Chinatown small businesses by the end of this year. How are you all planning to do that equitably, given how much even access to information, I imagine, is such a barrier when we're thinking about small businesses or lower income households?
And that's a factor we heavily considered. When PPP loans were first released, the Center of Responsible Lending estimated that 75% of Asian-owned restaurants were unlikely to qualify for a loan through mainstream credit union banks. So when we look at, for our work, Welcome to Chinatown, and how we're going to distribute this $1 million in grants, we have to have a very hyper-local approach. We don't assume technology access. We don't assume language access. Much of our work means that we need to go door to door, give out these flyers, and ensure that there's things are written in layman's terms. We're not trying to make things complicated. Even sometimes questions such as, why do you need this grant, or why is the community important for you? There are cultural and socioeconomical barriers that prevent these types of questions from being answered in a way that could prevent them from accessing it. So we have to take the time and ensure that we're really communicating and listening to the small business owners.
Cam, do you think that's also similar when you're doing voter education and voter turnout? Do you operate from the principle of not making assumptions?
Yeah, absolutely. We want to include every single voter, including limited English voters or no English voter even. And we try very hard to translate everything. And we also do door-to-door canvassing to reach our voters. We had to get a whole lot more creative during the pandemic because we had limited ability to canvass. But yeah, it's the same thing. I mean, our community is just very special, and we have to have people who know the community very well to effectively reach the community, even for loans or even for voting.
So when we were thinking about voting, Cam, we talked about the presidential election and then the special election. And then, of course, there were the tragic events in Atlanta, the shootings. How much do you think that changed the community in terms of galvanizing political action?
Well, we are definitely more galvanized now than before, having gone through 2 major elections where Asian American voters were record-breaking. And in Georgia, the Asian American vote was the margin of victory for Biden. And we were a huge part of the Senate wins too. So we know we have political power now, and we know we can make a difference. You just saw now that we now have a national hate crime because of Asian Americans protesting, rallying out on the streets, calling their legislator, demanding action over the tremendous increase of hate crimes against our communities. Now that we've seen that we can win, we're going to keep going.
Sure. How does that translate into, you think, political action in elections? Because I wonder how you think you can maintain that through an election cycle.
We can maintain that just because, we have the people now and the teams in place on the ground, and we know who we can reach out to rally our voters, rally our volunteers again, and have, stopping racism be another part of the election. I'm also looking at gun reform. That was a huge issue for the Atlanta spa shooting, because that the person got his guns the same day he went on a killing spree and shooting up, 3 Asian American businesses. So these issues, our community are starting to now understand. Guns now have more rights than people, because in Georgia, you cannot go register to vote and vote in the same day, but you can go buy a gun and as much ammo as you can carry and destroy lives. It's not right. Asian Americans understand this.
Victoria, Cam was talking about the momentum, and it's unfortunate to think about what prompted that. Do you feel like you're in a similar situation in New York with the amount of hate crimes that we've seen directed towards the Asian American community in New York? Do you feel like that changes the calculus for people wanting to support small businesses in your Welcome to Chinatown efforts?
It certainly brings to light a lot of the microaggressions and what are these systemic challenges that business owners have that are non-English speakers, immigrants, and AAPI own. But our concern is that we don't want to see this as just a moment, right? We truly want this to be able to be a movement, and that we're thinking for Welcome to Chinatown's our small business lens. What does it mean to invest in communities? What does it mean to invest in BIPOC ownership? So we have to ensure that the resources and the opportunities and what we're thinking is long term. Because communities like Chinatown have been affected. It has not just been COVID affected throughout 9/11, Hurricane Sandy. Are we investing in infrastructures that preserve historically and culturally significant ethnic enclaves like Manhattan's Chinatown?
What do you think your biggest challenge is going forward then? Is it maintaining that focus?
I think it's going to be maintaining that focus and ensuring that people understand about sustainability and about things such as like language, technology, access, which has been taken for granted a lot, and that COVID has just exacerbated. the challenges, they were already existing. So we really need to, when we're looking at policies and things that are written, what Cam said about representation really, really resonates, because that has to be seen.
Well, I want to thank both of you for taking the time to join us. Cam Ashling, co-founder and chairwoman at the Asian American Action Fund, and Victoria Lee, co-founder of Welcome to Chinatown. And thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone hopefully smarter, faster. For more information on my podcast, Axios Today, you can search for us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on the Axios app, or you can always visit axios.com/podcasts. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Have the best day.